making people feel respected, valued, appreciated. These are extremely important in terms of the morale of your organization and the way that you interact with clients, subcontractors, project partners. These things can all be put under the banner of this idea of civility. And that's what we are going to discuss today with my guest, Christine Porath. She is a tenured professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business, and she is the author of Mastering Civility. She's worked with folks like Google, Marriott, Cleveland Clinic, and Microsoft, and she is an expert in interpersonal relationships and how that affects the workplace. We're going to talk about what civility is, why it's important, how you can get civility into an organization, the link between civility and the people that you recruit, and how can you be civil in high-pressure situations that many of us find ourselves in when we are working on construction projects. This is a very straightforward, practical interview with insights that you'll be able to use right away. Feel free to check out Christine's work. We have links in the show notes to her books and her website, and I know you'll enjoy our conversation. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Christine, thank you for joining us today on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. I wanted to get you on the show because of your focus on civility in the workplace. Civility is an interesting word, and I'd like to just kick it right off by asking you, what do you mean by civility?
Yeah, I think the best synonym is respect. So making people feel valued, appreciated, and heard so that they feel like they're part of the team. They feel included or a sense of belonging. I think all of those things really exemplify what it means to feel respected, that you matter in some small way.
Okay. Why do you think civility is lacking in businesses?
The number one reason that we find that people say that they're disrespectful or rude or uncivil is because they feel stressed. And of course, nowadays that goes for most people. Another reason is that people lack training in it, they claim, that the leaders are role models of bad behavior, and so they're following their lead. They think it's a way to get ahead. Surprisingly, about 50% of people thought that it doesn't pay in the workplace to be civil. That, in other words, that coming across as powerful or rude is actually a way to get ahead. And so they're afraid of being civil in the workplace.
That's interesting. Let's explore those a little bit. So the first one that you talked about was people are uncivil because of stress. In your experience, stress is a reality. What are some effective ways that leaders manage their stress so that it doesn't affect the way they behave in a negative manner?
Yeah, well, I think one kind of just coping mechanism is whatever you do, whether that's exercise, whether it's yoga, meditation, mindfulness, you typically do that allows you to release that stress or feel better and take care of yourself. So I think a lot of it boils down to just really caring for yourself in ways that make you feel more calmer in your everyday, feeling better about yourself in small ways. One thing that contributes to this is not only like the burnout that we're seeing in life and in the workplace, but another thing is a lack of sleep. So it's really hard to connect with people, to be patient, to be kind, when you're sleep deprived. And people pick up on that with just an hour less of sleep. They call it a social repellent, where people literally, we're not necessarily aware of it if we're sleep deprived, but someone else is picking up on that and doesn't like us or want to interact with us nearly as much. So whether it's taking care of self via exercise throughout the day so that we're not hangry, the idea of sleeping and recovery, taking breaks throughout the day, if at all possible, even for a minute, couple minutes, 10 minutes, things like that can really aid us as far as just feeling better and then being better with people.
Terrific. So let me just ask you, because, when it comes to managing stress, people may say, I don't have time to manage my stress. What do you think is the simplest, easiest step that someone can take right away to be more effective at managing stress?
I think that one thing would be carving out just small moments where they have some time to decompress. That could be a few minutes nowadays between meetings or between getting somewhere or between projects. For me personally, like working out and exercise has always been a huge part of my life. So I need to get that in the morning for myself. Like people have different routines, of course, but I know that I'm better throughout the day if I take that time. And I'll make up the productivity or the efficiency like a lot of folks. So for me personally, like even experimenting with that kind of stuff and seeing, does this work well? Can I carve out time? Seems to bode well. I think another big thing nowadays that we see is if you can stay away from all the negativity in a small way. For some of us, that means pulling off of social media or not tuning into the news or certain websites or those kind of things. But really being proactive about reducing the negativity in your life and what you're taking in, because we're not always aware of it. We feel that and we give off that negativity or that stress in ways that we're just being primed throughout the day. And even things like if you can control who you're around, that matters. And we don't get to necessarily choose who we work with, but things like who we're with, what we're taking in, what we're consuming, it all matters.
So what's the difference between being appropriately assertive and uncivil? Because people listening to the show, they're in construction, and sometimes you just got to step up and say, hey, dude, you need to be on the job site. This needs to get done. And if it doesn't get done, then we're going to have a stronger conversation. And that's just the way that it works. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's all in the eyes of the beholder. So one of the really tricky things about incivility is just that it's all about how you make someone feel. So we may think we have good intentions. We're giving them very important feedback about how to be more competent. And they may feel like, what a jerk, demeaning me or belittling me in ways feel terrible. And so I think there's a couple things. One would be if you can create a culture where you're radically candid, like what you just said to me, you're coaching someone up. You're trying to improve their performance, the likelihood of them being successful in, let's say, the construction business. If that's the case, then the whole idea is that you have to demonstrate at some point that you care about them personally. That's what Kim Scott would say about radical candor. So you care personally, you challenge directly. If I know that you care about me, and so it could be as simple, there's research that shows that if you preface this stuff with just 19 words, and the idea is, I care, I think you can do better, and here's what I suggest, or I care about you, and I know you can do more, then you're off and running. But I think so much of this comes down with the civility stuff to what Doug Conant calls touch points. So these brief daily interactions you have with people throughout the day. And these things do not require a huge investment of time. But if you're saying hello to someone, or you're saying how you're doing, or how can I help at different moments throughout the weeks or the months or the year, someone notices that. And they give you the benefit of the doubt typically, such that then when you criticize me and say, hey, it's got to be better, or I need you to do X, and here's why, and it didn't work because of this, people are much less defensive and much more likely to deliver on your feedback.
You had, there was this idea of role models and a lack of role models. How can I become a role model of civility? What do I need to focus on?
Yeah, I think the idea is you walk the talk. So these little touch points that I mentioned, that you're doing those things. Some of it comes down to tone, which is hard. We can't accurately evaluate our tone while we're speaking. So I may sound very condescending, even though I have the best of intentions and I like you. It may be literally my vocal tone. It may be where I come from and the directness of my language. All of that is colored in ways that we're not accurately evaluating, especially in the moment. If I recorded myself, I'd have a better chance. But even then, we are not very self-aware. So about 95% of people believe that they're self-aware. They have a good sense of their strengths, their weaknesses, how they come across, giving feedback. Tasha Eurich has found that only 10 to 15% are self-aware. So on any given day, that's 80% of us missing the mark as far as, again, probably thinking we have good intentions, we're trying to do well for the person, for our company, for our team, and yet we're completely missing the mark and may have blind spots.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said about us being unaware of how we're coming across to others, even though we think we're incredibly sensitive. You've worked with some companies like Microsoft, Google, Marriott. In your work with organizations, and you don't have to name names, but can you think of an organization that when you began to work with them, they were really struggling with some of this stuff, and over time they made some incremental changes?
Yeah, I mean, there was one law firm that brought me in early on when I was working, and they were having a lot of issues with retention and people leaving, not wanting to work around certain partners, let's say, that may have had a reputation for this. It generally being pretty large power differences between people, which oftentimes creates this sense of they don't value me. And the power differences, that's where you typically tend to see more of this stuff. And so they were just struggling, and yet they went through training. They came up with what they called the Civility Code. So these were 10 things that they, meaning their people of all levels, came up with. And they joked and said it was the 10 Commandments. But the managing partner had them put in granite, like engraved, and put in their front lobby. And literally, this was something where they said, these are things that we feel comfortable calling each other out on. We're going to hold the bar here now. And within a year and a half, they won Best Place to Work, which was not common for a law firm. So I think that in a relatively short amount of time, you can make some pretty big strides on this stuff. It is key that you have people that are, to your point, like the role models. They're setting the tone. They're willing to live by it. They're willing to invest in it or call people out on it in the moment. And ideally, people feel comfortable doing that with each other.
Do standards of civility, I've got a two-part question here. Should standards of civility differ from company to company? And how do expectations for civility differ from generation to generation?
Yeah, I think it's completely normal and appropriate for things to vary from company to company. I think ideally that employees or leaders would be coming up with their own that are appropriate. For example, in some cases, when I give talks or trainings, we'll cover how to be civil on email or just some basic things, nothing too particular, but the idea being in some workplaces, like that's not an issue or they're not relying on email a lot. So it does vary quite a bit. I think that it's important that they fit your values and what you're going to stick to, and that ideally people are comfortable then calling each other out on this. You really want a situation where it's okay to, in the moment, let's say, it's very apparent what the norms are, and here's where things break down. You've talked about soccer or football and yellow card, red card. Like, you know what these things are. And so when it happens, like there was an academic university I was at, where in our department, we had yellow card, red card signals just to each other because there were some anger management issues. And this was just a way of helping each other out. But I've seen it done really well. There was a government agency that I worked with that had 10 principles of civility. And they were so well known, meaning it was on the back of their name badges. They reinforced this in different ways and it was a real mix of different types of employees, janitors, cleaners, gardeners, people running power, people in, I would say, professional leadership type positions. So it ran the gamut, and yet they were very comfortable calling each other out when it happened. So I was there for my last training session, and this one gentleman just said, oh yeah, we just call each other out. We just say 7, dude, 7, or 5, man, 5. So like literally they knew the 10 and it was easy. And I think it's better that way, where it's almost informal. And it's this idea of, I use the word coach because I love sports. So to me, that signifies we don't have to write each other up for these things. That may happen if people aren't adhering to the yellow card, red card, or the norms, so to speak. But in general, I think these things can be done where we see ourselves raising our level and helping improve each other's game, so to speak.
It's interesting because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about you institute, let's say you have these 10 commandments or 10 directives or something. Some people in the company can be way too zealous with those things and use them as leverage in a power dynamic that becomes unhealthy, where sort of the weak bully the strong, so to speak. So how does a company avoid that situation?
Yeah, I think that's probably up to the strong to manage the powerful so that they're having the conversation. And again, I think it really pays to adhere to what Kim Scott talks about, radical candor. Like when I'm giving a talk on this, I try to make it clear that civility doesn't mean just being like, it's not about sugarcoating stuff. It doesn't mean that you can't have hard conversations. You can't disagree. You can't give really negative feedback. All of those things you want, right? And so it's a matter of, I think, the how. And so in her way, again, it's care personally, challenge directly. And so I think it's up to a leader, those that have more power, more status, leading the pack, to recalibrate if needed, or to point out that these aren't meant to be used in a passive aggressive way kind of thing. So I think you may have to have hard conversations along the way. Civility isn't avoiding those things. It's tackling them, but it's all about the style and the how of it. I'm not screaming at you about it. I'm going to talk to you about it.
Let me ask you, the other aspect of that two-parter was the generational differences in terms of civility. What have you noticed in the workplace, like between Gen Xer, yeah, I'm a Gen Xer, and then you got your millennials, you got your Gen Zers, you got a few remaining boomers. How does it differ from generation to generation?
Yeah, I think in general, we do see differences for sure. I think one thing is that you see younger generations, they're much more comfortable multitasking. And so in some ways, for example, that may come across as not paying attention to people, let's say in a meeting or in the moment. You'll see younger people often be on their phones and or texting as you're talking, as you're whatever. In some cases, maybe we give them the benefit of the doubt and they're taking notes, but regardless, like they are always on and they're used to getting pinged and pinging people constantly. And I think years ago, even that was somewhat disturbing to other people, where it was like, you're giving me your full attention. And so I think that there can be differences around that. I think that in general, I've heard feedback, if you will, from older employees saying like, why is it that we get younger employees that have such a lack of respect? And I think the idea is that younger folks are coming into workplaces seeing less of a power and status difference, and maybe being more comfortable just interacting and open door kind of thing, candid feedback, that kind of thing. I remember there was a law firm partner that said that he had what we would call an intern. So these were summer associates. He had a summer associate come in and he gave him kind of project to work on and gave him the directions. And the guy looked at him and said, okay, memo it up for me and get it back to me. And the law partner is sitting there thinking, what? You're an intern. I just gave you a task. Like, how about doing it? Now it's back on my plate where I'm supposed to memo it up and get it to you. And he had a sense of humor as he told me the story. But I hear about those kind of things. And I think that there can be some friction around the how. And again, power and status differences and respect around, let's say, experience or tenure or things like that. And there are probably some benefits to not seeing huge differences. But there are also feelings around, I've earned this, so I deserve your respect. And I think in some cases, younger employees are not seen as bringing as much of that as others might want or expect.
Why do you think companies fail in their attempts to be more civil?
Why do companies fail to be more civil?
Well, let's say you introduce the initiative or they contact you, Christine. I'm sure this has happened, right? So I contact the personal trainer and I say, I want to get in shape, but then I never show up to the gym, even though, you know what I'm saying? So why do companies fail even if they want to be more civil?
Yeah, I think it's what you mentioned, which Marshall Goldsmith talks about. We may have good intentions, but if we're not putting it into play, like if we're not disciplined to actually do the work, to go to the gym, to punch in and run on the treadmill or do whatever we're going to do. But also in this case, what Marshall Goldsmith would point to is we're not closing the feedback loop. In other words, we're not getting information on whether we're improving. So it's this idea of a lack of self-awareness around, are we improving? We assume, yeah, it's been on my mind. I'm trying. I care. I think I'm coming across as very respectful. Whereas you really want that feedback to know, am I doing better? So in one case, I knew a coach he was coaching a woman who was always the smartest in the room. She was responsible for billions of dollars of business, and it had gotten to the point where, because she talked over people and things like that, people just stopped offering ideas or speaking up in meetings. So like her teams really weren't working for her in a way. And so once she got this feedback from a coach, and she had a tendency to interrupt in meetings, and again, with good thoughts, good points, but it was not working for the people below her. So she shared with her team that she recognized that this was an issue. She even shared that they were going to an offsite. So it's after several days, she was going to follow up with them to see how things were working. And it helped because the coach actually gave her something to do, which was anytime she wanted to interrupt, he suggested she tap her foot. So it was like a physical thing where you're moving forward, but it's like lunging. I'm not going to lunge verbally. And so she could share even just the idea that she shared with her team. Listen, I recognize this is an issue. I'm working on it. I care about it enough to work with someone, pay someone. I'm disclosing it, which shows a lot of vulnerability. And I'm not proud of this because I know that you voiced that this is having a negative effect on you. Now I'm going to work on it, and I'm going to care enough to, again, be vulnerable and ask you for feedback about how am I doing? Do you notice a difference? But that last part in particular, that's, again, putting yourself out there, going to the trouble of gathering feedback, risking how it's going to feel when you did all right, but you slipped up several times kind of thing. So I think that kind of method is one that we would want to suggest to others.
Let me ask you, in your experience, what is the best way for someone to solicit that feedback? Because, there's tons of different 360 processes. You can go the dusty binder route. You can go the 3-question route. What do you think is the most effective way for an executive to get feedback from their people that's going to be genuine and helpful?
Yeah, if you have the resources, Dan Harris with 10% Happier just did a great TED Talk on this method where several years ago, he solicited feedback from others. He actually had a firm that collected a lot of feedback, but he got an official 360 report, and it was damning, to say the least. And he was shocked, I think, to read just what people thought of him. It was very extensive and it was hard, right? And so he had to decide what was he going to do with that. Now, 360 feedback is really tough because for a number of reasons, but you have to have a culture where people feel safe speaking up. And oftentimes that requires a lot more work than you might think because you're often getting feedback from people that have less power and status than you. If they don't feel like it's anonymous, in other words, how many people are you collecting feedback from? They may not speak up. But certainly if there are any reservations about how the feedback's going to be used or the type of person that you are, if they are scared of any kind of retaliation or revenge or blowback that might come, even if others hear about some of the negativity and could pin it on them. As much as I recommend 360 feedback, I think it's a lot more challenging in terms of you have to have the culture, you have to really put the work in to ensure that you're going to get useful feedback in return. But if you do that, it can be, again, as Dan Harris has talked about publicly, so helpful for people. Short of that, I do think collecting one from your peers, your subordinates, people even above you could be very helpful. Like I do that with teams, whether those are MBA teams or executive teams, even undergrad business. Literally, if they're working in teams, they're giving each other very specific feedback. And I try to prime them and say feedback is a gift and takes courage and even coach them just a bit on receiving feedback, which I think is really something that unfortunately isn't talked about a lot. And there's a great book called Thanks for the Feedback. And I think it's something that, again, I didn't see out there very much because we talk a lot about giving feedback, but we don't talk a lot about something, just really basic things that could be helpful about receiving feedback as well. But the one-on-one stuff is super helpful.
It's really interesting because you brought up something with the example of the executive that you shared about when she's about to interrupt, there's that physical cue. I know I have a similar physical cue when I'm beginning to get distracted where I like ball up the toes on my right foot and then I say to myself, ground yourself. Yeah, and that's something that I picked up from one of my mentors. And I think what's important with this feedback is it doesn't have to be super complex if you nail the right behaviors and practice those and put them into some habits. That can really help in terms of transforming the way that you're behaving.
Definitely.
Let me ask you this. Construction is inherently, like I said earlier, conflict-ridden and uncivil. How can a company begin to walk this path to civility?
I think one thing that we suggest, so there's 4 main steps that I recommend. One would be recruiting and selecting people that kind of fit your culture. So if you say you have certain standards that you decided on, for example, that you said, does that vary for every industry, for every company? Yes, it does. Well, try to get people that are going to fit what you're looking for. And I think that if I had to pick one area to invest in, basically, it would be that. That's probably the biggest return on your investment, just because turnover is so incredibly costly. And incivility is like a virus and it spreads. So it's contagious. So you can try to hide someone, and that is a strategy, and it works better than not. But it's hard because this stuff is going to spread quickly. And so there's this multiplier effect going on. So I think starting with who you select, doing your background checks, talking to people that worked with them. And ideally, one kind of simple thing, maybe it's not so simple, but in theory, it is get feedback, not from just the people that are on the reference list. So the 3 people that they've kissed up to. It's people kiss up and kick down. So what you really want is peers, or better yet, people that worked for them, or like the parking lot attendant, the waiter or waitress, seeing people that have less power and status. How do they treat them? The person that scheduled the interview, all of those folks, that matters a lot. And then the idea of coaching, we talked about a little bit, that really encompasses a lot of different things, like, for example, setting the expectations. So that could be some of the norms that we talked about, creating those. That could be training, which has been shown to be really effective. That could be a little bit of the role modeling and walking the talk. And so there's a lot of stuff in there, but I think that's a really important aspect. Scoring it, what I call. And so that's, are you including it in their performance management review if they have one of those? Or that's a very messy performance management reviews. So what about just informal things? Are you complimenting people that are respectful? Are you telling stories where you're talking about a construction worker that served a client well with a really challenging jerk of a person that they were having to deal with on a regular basis? Did they find a way to muster the restraint and kind of work through and get the team through that? And using those stories, because those stories are fantastic. They stick, they get passed on. They're a great way to move the culture. And then the last aspect, I would say, is what I call practice. And that's the piece that I think is, again, very hard, which is holding people accountable. So once you get the feedback, what are you going to do with it? And there's an example that I often use with this, which comes from Danny Meyer, who owns and founded Shake Shack, but also owns a lot of Manhattan restaurants. And he talks about how if he has a chef that's rude, let him know it and draw the line once. And then if it happens again, he'll fire the person. And people say, how can you do that? That is your talent. And he says, because customers can taste it. We see that in the research too. Like, it may happen in the back room, but ultimately it gets passed on in ways that then people feel that customers, clients, suppliers, folks like that will feel the effects of that. So that's an easy one for me to talk about, the accountability piece or practicing piece. Yeah. And I think if you have to carry that out, that can be really challenging, including letting someone go if they don't follow.
It's interesting because you frame it rightly, beginning at the top of the funnel, so to speak, with your recruiting. If you understand who you are as a company, you can then attract the right people, repel the wrong people, and hopefully through that, get the right people in who reflect your culture. And a lot of these civility issues can be dealt with through that process.
Yeah, and that follows what we call the employment life cycle. So like how it works. But the truth is you can start anywhere. And I think that there's value anywhere. I think that the more consistent you are with these pieces, meaning like the groups that I've seen do this really effectively, you asked about this earlier, it's the idea of, yes, okay, let's pay attention to who we're bringing in. Okay, let's have some norms of respect. If we have the means, let's find some training or send some talk links around that get at how to listen, how to do some of these simple things that might be on our norm list better, that are really digestible. We can read it, we can listen to it. They're basic things that we can take with us, that we can start doing tomorrow, that really get us there. But the more consistent you are, the quicker you'll get there, the more likely it is to stick. But the truth is you can start anywhere, and you don't have to be at the top of the leadership level to start doing these things. To your point, if someone's leading a team or leading a crew, if they start walking the talk, chances are it's going to feel better, and people are going to start mimicking that behavior, copying that behavior, living that way. That's the hope, at least. And so these things, they get reinforced naturally. That idea, again, going back to the sports example, but if we're having fun, we're high-fiving each other, etc., it's like that energy builds, and then we start giving that off to others in ways that, and they show this actually with NBA teams and others, that like touch actually propels us forward. So when we're doing that, when we're supporting each other in those ways, that actually pays in some pretty neat ways.
So we're looking at the high five as opposed to the right cross, the one that Draymond did to Jordan Poole, huh?
Yes, that would be fantastic. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't put that together. But yes, I love that example. And now, because of COVID and everything, some of these examples are not what they were, but hopefully we'll get back to that. The fist bump or the emojis on this stuff, it all works, I think.
Definitely. Christine, you've been very generous with your time. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and how people can get in touch with you, take advantage of some of the stuff that you've produced.
I have a new book out, Mastering Community, which has a lot of these stories, sports and otherwise. It has a chapter on respect that builds on some of this stuff and what groups are doing. The book prior to that was Mastering Civility. I have a website, ChristinePorath.com, and it's meant to have some resources that are helpful to people. And there's a TED Talk out there for those that like that kind of thing, or TED podcast and things like that as well. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, you got that TED Talk with over 3 million views.
Yeah, it's a popular topic. Thank you.
It is. That's awesome. So we're going to link to the show notes, to the books, and to the website. And Christine, I appreciate you joining me. I know that you have a lot of experience. So if you had to pick between basketball and soccer, which one would you pick?
Basketball came more intuitively, although now I'm working with the UNC women's soccer team. So I've just had the best time with them, and talk about a culture that has great value, and players actually rate each other on these core values. So I've learned a lot from this culture and how they balance competition and a sense of community or connection in ways that I think is really challenging in the business world, but I'm really just having the time of my life close to sports again, which is fantastic.
What have you learned from them in terms of that balancing community and competition? Because that's, in construction, that's a huge thing.
Yeah, they measure everything in ways that I would have never guessed. So Anson Dorrance, he's the coach. He has 22 national championships. He coached the women's national team with Mia Hamm and others and won a World Cup. But he has what's called the competitive cauldron, which is, if you could think about measuring everything, every step that they take, every header that they do at practice, every corner kick that they take, like literally there's a crew of statisticians measuring everything every day in practice. It all gets tabulated. So it's like a little Excel sheet with where you got drafted by your peers, just like a fantasy draft, and then how you performed, what the gap is on that. So it's all getting factored in. Every game, there's objective ratings by someone that scores players in the way that they take analytics into account. So all of that gets tabulated, and ultimately they get ranked as far as the top player down to the 37th player. And they can see during their player development meetings where they're falling short, because there's a page with each one of these things. So they can see that while they may be great at one-on-ones at practice, they may be terrible at heading and that's hurting them. Or they may be doing really well in games, but they came in and they weren't fit. So their athletic testing at the beginning is poor. and there are some things, of course, that they have more or less ability to improve. Like some of them, vertical jump, we may not all have that. So, but there are some things where they'll focus on what they can improve. But the idea is that they climb the ladder, so to speak. So they may come in and they may be on the national team, but it's the U19 national team or it's from another country. And they're thrown into this cauldron. And instead of being the top player, like many of them were, they're now 30th. And that's hard. And so then, and they're getting this constant feedback is just coming at them. It's posted at practice, but they're being measured every day. And so it's about how do you bring your best game every day? How do you move from 20th in your freshman year to 12th your sophomore year to 5th your junior year to 1? And he can tell them in truth, if you're in the top 5, that's pro level. That's actually national team. Top 10 is probably pro level. And they have enough examples to know that's kind of how it happened. It's incredibly competitive at practice every day, but they balance that with this idea of they care about each other. And I think part of that is the recruiting that we talked about. Like you're going to come there if you care. A huge part of it is their core values. So they have 13 core values that they rate each other on 3 times a year. The players do. And they are values that have nothing to do with soccer performance. So the closest thing that I thought focus on the field, it's focus in the classroom. So it's all about character and character development. And the idea is if you're below a 3 average-wise on the 13, he would want you to transfer or to leave the program. In other words, like they want to identify where you're falling short, where you're in kind of the pink zone under a 3. And that's what you want to work on improving, evaluated by your peers. And so that idea of being a good team player, it matters in ways that you either get to be a part of the team or you're probably not going to feel like a part of the team. And then just, again, they go out of their way to pay attention to stuff so that they're making each other feel good about being a part of the team, like they care about each other. And again, I do think recruiting has something to do about it. I don't think that you're going to come here if you don't care about that at all, or you're going to quickly realize I better. It's not going to probably work well for either party on that side. And that's true of organizations too.
Yeah, it's tremendous. What are you actually doing with the soccer team?
I'm working on a book with Anson Doran on how to develop people and really the culture in which you do that. And so that's been a kind of a long-standing project. And then we put some things into place and we experiment with, for example, a new value is how energizing is someone. Because I know de-energizing, you don't have to be uncivil to be a de-energizer. There's a certain vibe that you may give off where people are like a repellent, whereas the energizers, whether they're hurt, whether they're sitting on the bench, whether they're, whatever the case may be, they are providing something and that shows. And again, we know that stuff is contagious. And so that's one that we've seen in the last year make a difference around some of this stuff. So it's really fun because Anson's like a mad scientist who's just constantly experimenting with stuff from very different fields that he thinks will help them, especially around character development and academics, but in all ways. So it's been a lot of fun for me to learn from them and, of course, again, be around sports.
Awesome. Well, Christine, I really appreciate you joining me and thank you for your insights. I look forward to your successes in terms of the new book mastering community, and we'll make sure to link to those in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us on Construction Genius today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again for listening to Construction Genius today. Hope you enjoyed my interview. Check out the various links in the show notes to learn more about her work. And of course, as we always say, feel free to share this interview with other people that you think would benefit from it. And also give us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening to Construction Genius.